architects of liberal economic reform in Australia. Hawke and Keating. It was the Labor Party. It was controversial because it was the Labor Party that did it. But they did this because really what you had after the Cold War was this emerging worldwide consensus that free markets, capitalism, and the idea of an individual over collective really is the philosophical disposition that we should be taking. That consensus, I would argue, has meant that ideas don't really emerge in politics anymore. If you find it difficult to tell the major parties apart, it's because they are difficult to tell apart, because it's hard to identify what the animating philosophies of them are. The Liberal Party, I guess, still is a little bit clearer, particularly economically. But what's the Labor Party about? Can't really be about the collective anymore, because we don't do the collective. That's not what our politics is about. The sad thing, I think, is that that means that there is nowhere for politics to go really other than managerialism. One of the things I found most concerning about the 2004 election, when we were in the middle of a war in Iraq that wasn't going terribly well, to put it mildly, was that we had an entire election campaign based around interest rates. Interest rates are important to a lot of people, I understand that. But what was the idea at the base of that election campaign? I would argue the idea was that we live in a company, and as long as the balance sheet looks pretty good and the figures are good, then we should re-elect the board. And we did. Fine. If the election result is not what I'm concerned about, it's the rationality of it that concerns me. I fear that this is only about to get worse in our political culture, because our political culture is becoming more managerial, more focus group driven, and less about ideas. And one of the reasons for this, and this is the great paradox of our time, is that we have an all-pervasive political media. You can't escape it now. There's 24-hour news channels. Newspapers don't produce newspapers anymore. They produce websites and they attach a newspaper to it. And some people leave newspapers for websites, because this is, and that's not a criticism, this is the emerging way that political media and reporting is done. The thing about it, having a 24-hour news channel, is you got to fill 24 hours. How do you do that? Well, it's very, very hard to fill that space with ideas. Really hard. Because you've got to find people who have them. Or people who don't have them but know about them and can talk about them. What we're getting instead, in the drive to feed this beast that is ever present, is a focus on politics as a game. I've said elsewhere, we in this country, and this might be more true in Melbourne than here, but I think it's true everywhere. In this country, we do politics as though it's sport, and we do sport as though it's politics. We report on politics by trying to figure out who's winning, who's losing, who won this, was this politically good, did this position them well. And we talk about sport as though ideas really matter. Player management philosophies. All sorts of psychological questions that get discussed. This is highbrow stuff. And that's where you find ideas in the newspapers, the back pages. You go to in the political coverage, we don't do that. We just don't. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is the thing I've alluded to, that in a 24-hour news environment, it's much easier to conduct a poll and then spend the rest of the day discussing the poll. Think about that fact. This is an observation that someone from the UK made to me who works in media. He said he was astonished by how frequently an opinion poll is the lead item on a news bulletin in this country. It's not news. It's a poll. Nothing happened. So that's point number one. But not of the whole. But that's one effect of the media cycle. But the other thing is that as politics has become more pervasive, it's become necessarily more populist, because politicians then have to respond to the media cycle where they need to fit into the structure that exists. And that means that ideas don't work. And one of the things that I am really frustrated about are the number of people saying, I'm so sick of politics being negative, I'm so sick of politicians just throwing grenades at one another and then going to the ballot box and rewarding exactly that behaviour. And for those of you, and I've heard so many people say this to me since the election result, who are upset, for instance, at the way the coalition is behaving and say, I just wish that Malcolm Turnbull was the leader of the coalition. Let me say this to you. If Malcolm Turnbull was the leader of the coalition, Kevin Rudd would be Prime Minister now, probably with an increased majority. We would have an ETS. Kevin Rudd's great moral challenge would have been met, and he would have been a Supreme Prime Minister who'd achieved a reform. And Malcolm Turnbull, who would have negotiated a package and helped usher it through for the benefit of the country, would be on the scrap heap of the Liberal Party. We reward adversarial political behaviour. And we do that because we interact with it through a structure in 24-hour media that facilitates that. And we have such a concern with bias in media that there is nowhere to go for a political commentator who wants to discuss ideas, because the only way to maintain neutrality, which is a key commodity for a journalist now, the only way to maintain neutrality is to avoid discussing ideas and discuss the scoreboard. Is the mining tax a good idea? I don't want to talk about that, but it's going to hurt them electorally in these seats. Now, I don't blame journalists for that. This is a structural problem, and it's for that reason I'm not convinced that we will escape it. And on that cheery note, I'll end.
Thank you, Waleed. He has, however, violated a tenet of this panel discussion, which is that you have to insult the profession of the next speaker. And instead he has gone straight for the journalistic jugular. And Miriam has escaped miraculously. So I will hand over to Miriam, who I'm hoping will talk to us to a degree about some of the ideas that she thinks Australia needs, but also that process of alchemy by which ideas can or cannot become policy and enter that process of interacting with government and making things happen.
Thanks, Anne. So I have a similarly cynical analysis to Waleed, but I think a slightly more hopeful conclusion. But I do just want to start off with a confession that's kind of related to my profession. I work for a policy think tank. It has the word policy in its name. When I was at uni and I was a sort of idealistic, world-changing kind of aspirant, I avoided all of the subjects in my